The Portuguese fleet that carried him to India faced one of the most dangerous ocean passages known to European sailors. The Cape of Good Hope had earned its reputation as a ship graveyard where violent storms and massive waves destroyed vessels attempting to round Africa's southern tip. Portuguese captains called this stretch of water the Cape of Storms before King John II renamed it to sound more encouraging to future expeditions. The 30-year-old Ferdinand Magellan stood on deck, watching enormous swells crash over the bow as his ship fought through the turbulent waters that separated the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Portuguese strategy for building their Eastern Empire required establishing a permanent foothold on India's west coast that could serve as a supply base for further expansion into Asia. Lisbon had identified Goa as the perfect location because of its natural harbors and strategic position along established trade routes between Arabia and Southeast Asia. The port city controlled access to the lucrative spice markets that European merchants desperately wanted to reach without paying inflated prices to Middle Eastern intermediaries. Capturing Goa would give Portugal direct control over the pepper and cinnamon trade that generated enormous profits for whoever controlled the shipping routes. Magellan served under Albuquerque during the systematic conquest of Goa, witnessing the brutal precision that would become the template for Portuguese colonization throughout the Indian Ocean. Albuquerque's forces surrounded the city and cut off all supply lines before launching coordinated attacks from both land and sea. The Portuguese commander ordered the execution of all Muslim defenders and forced the Hindu population into slavery or exile. Portuguese soldiers burned mosques and converted temples into Christian churches, while Albuquerque established Portuguese law over the conquered territory. Recent archaeological excavations at Goa's fort have revealed the massive scale of Portuguese construction projects that transformed the city into their eastern colonial headquarters. Ground-penetrating radar has identified the foundations of administrative buildings, military fortifications, and residential quarters that housed thousands of Portuguese colonists and their families. The archaeological evidence shows that Portugal invested enormous resources in creating a permanent European settlement that could support their expanding operations throughout Asia. Excavated artifacts include Portuguese coins, weapons, religious items, and household goods that demonstrate the extent of their commitment to establishing a lasting presence in India. Serving under Albuquerque provided Magellan with crucial experience in long-distance provisioning and naval logistics that would prove essential for his later circumnavigation attempt. He observed how Portuguese commanders calculated food and water supplies for journeys lasting several months without reliable opportunities for resupply. The expedition taught him about managing crew morale during extended periods at sea and dealing with diseases that spread rapidly in the confined spaces of sailing ships. Magellan learned how experienced navigators used celestial observations to determine their position when no familiar landmarks were visible for weeks at a time. The establishment of Goa as Portugal's eastern capital created a permanent base that supported Portuguese expansion throughout the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia. The city became the administrative center where Portuguese governors coordinated military campaigns, trade negotiations, and colonial policies across their growing Asian empire. Goa's strategic location allowed Portuguese fleets to control shipping routes between India, Malaysia, and the Spice Islands while providing a secure harbor where damaged ships could be repaired and crews could recover from long voyages. The success of this eastern expansion demonstrated Portugal's ability to project power across vast ocean distances and maintain control over profitable trade networks. Witnessing Portugal's success in establishing their Eastern Empire convinced Magellan that similar profits might be achieved by finding western routes to the same Asian markets. He calculated that sailing west across the Atlantic might provide faster access to the Spice Islands without the dangerous journey around Africa's southern coast. Magellan recognized that western routes would also avoid the established Portuguese bases in the Indian Ocean, where competing expeditions would face military opposition from his own countrymen. The young navigator began to envision an alternative approach that could reach the profitable spice markets while bypassing Portugal's existing eastern infrastructure. The Goa expedition also exposed Magellan to the enormous profits generated by controlling direct access to Asian spice markets. He witnessed Portuguese merchants selling pepper, nutmeg, and cinnamon in European markets at prices that were 10 times higher than their purchase costs in Asia. The young navigator learned that transportation costs represented only a small fraction of the final selling price, meaning that anyone who could establish their own direct route to the Spice Islands could generate extraordinary wealth. This first-hand exposure to the economics of the spice trade motivated Magellan to search for alternative routes that could bypass Portuguese control over existing shipping lanes. Portuguese success in establishing Goa as their eastern headquarters planted the seed of an idea that would eventually lead Magellan to propose his western expedition to the Spanish crown. The expedition demonstrated that properly planned and supplied ocean voyages could generate enormous returns on investment while establishing lasting political control over distant territories. But first, Magellan's service would take him further east to an even more strategic location where Portugal was expanding their control over the spice trade. The discovery of Malacca in 1511 would provide the final piece of his education in global commerce and introduce him to someone whose origins would later become central to understanding the true story of the first circumnavigation. The Malacca slave market discovery. Ferdinand